The bandstand in Flaxborough had always been an object of civic pride, though even its most loyal admirers privately admitted that pride might be too strong a word. It stood in the municipal gardens like an elderly relative who had once been robust and handsome, but now survived largely through habit, stubbornness, and careful coats of paint. Its circular railings bore the faint scallops of rust beneath municipal green. Its roof, patched and repatched, sighed faintly whenever the wind passed over it, which, on this particular Tuesday evening, was often and with growing hostility. Inside the bandstand, the Flaxborough Civic Band was rehearsing. The word rehearsing was itself charitable. Councillor Horace Bimble, who conducted with a ladle rather than a baton since the original baton had once been mislaid by a trombonist with a lively sense of humour, frowned at the clarinets as if moral weakness was solely responsible for their tone. "How many times," he said, tapping the ladle against the music stand with a sound like a pudding meeting its destiny, "must we agree on a shared idea of tempo?" The wind, apparently unimpressed by the concept of tempo, threw itself against the bandstand with a sudden gust. The music wavered, recovered briefly, and then slid off in 3 different directions at once. Mrs. Grimshaw, who played the triangle with a seriousness that bordered upon the ecclesiastical, tightened her lips but persevered. At exactly 8 minutes past 7 the lights went out. This, in Flaxborough, was considered sufficiently unusual to qualify as an event. For a few brave seconds no one spoke. The darkness was complete, upholstered in the soft mutter of wind and the faint, offended creak of wood. Then Mr. Percy Lugg, who had once touched a live wire while fetching a kite from a sub-station hedge and never quite trusted electricity again, let out a small, deliberate cough. "It's gone," he announced. "Yes," said Councillor Bimble with restrained patience. "We have all noticed that, Mr. Lugg." Someone knocked over a chair. A muted exclamation suggested it might have been sat upon. The trombone gave a startled, involuntary blat, as if expressing what everyone felt but could not adequately phrase. When the emergency lantern was lit, its bulb flickered like a timid conscience, casting the band in an unflattering amber gloom. Faces appeared in fragments, a nose here, a chin there, like a badly assembled jigsaw of municipal life. "That won't be the storm," Mrs. Grimshaw observed. "There isn't one yet," said another voice. "That's why it won't be that," she replied, satisfied. In the watery light of the lantern, Captain Arthur Peebles was absent. This, at first, was not remarkable. Captain Peebles often absented himself in spirit and occasionally in body during rehearsals. A retired shipping clerk who had never seen the sea but had read extensively about it, he was prone to drifting away in moments of brass-heavy reflection. Still it was noted. "Peebles?" called Councillor Bimble, peering into the corner where the bass drum normally stood like a solemn altar. "Captain?" No answer. "He was here when we began," said Mrs. Grimshaw, who noticed such things partly from vigilance and partly because she distrusted anyone who arrived late. "He said something about a draft," offered Mr. Lugg, "or possibly a draft." "He said it twice," another added. The band exchanged looks which, in small English towns, are capable of conveying entire histories of doubt without the inconvenience of articulation. A door creaked at the rear of the bandstand. Outside, beyond the municipal gardens, the first distant roll of thunder wandered across the flat Lincolnshire sky like an old dog investigating a hedge. It was at that exact unremarkable moment, the lantern guttering, the wind tugging at the curtains, and the bass drum staring into the dimness without its proper custodian, that a quieter, subtler absence made itself felt. The small locked cupboard beneath the conductor's platform, in which the band's petty cash tin was kept for the purchase of biscuits, valve oil and symbolic morale, stood very slightly ajar. No one noticed at once. In Flaxborough, things had a way of pausing before they became important. By morning, the storm had arrived with a sense of grievance, as though it felt it had been poorly received the night before. Rain needled the pavements of Flaxborough in a steady, unromantic manner, flattening geraniums, discouraging dogs, and lending the high street a reflective sheen that made everyone look more interesting than they were. The wind, having had a promising rehearsal the previous evening, now performed with confidence. The bandstand incident, formerly an oddity, had matured overnight into a matter of opinion. At Pomeroy's tea rooms, the regular Wednesday gathering of ladies who described themselves as informal met with a punctuality that suggested otherwise. Cups were placed with deliberate firmness, saucers received them with little private sighs of relief. "I said at the time," murmured Mrs. Alsop, whose memory improved notably when an audience was present, "that darkness alters a person. It removes their sense of outline." She stirred her tea, as if attempting to draw a moral shape from it. "They're saying it was the storm," said Miss Trixie Vale, who read everything twice, once for information and once for emphasis. "But there wasn't a storm yet." "That's what makes it suspicious," Mrs. Alsop replied. At the cooperative stores, Mr. Denton, who sold bootlaces and heard everything, passed on a version in which Captain Peebles had been lured outside by a shadowy figure carrying either a lantern or a small accordion. To Mr. Gibbs the barber, the story became one of heated bandstand politics, a word which in Flaxborough covered everything from the positioning of hymn sheets to the moral standing of the bassoon. Meanwhile, in the bandstand itself, Councillor Bimble stood with his hands in his pockets, peering at the slightly open cupboard door with injured expression. "I'm positive I locked that," he said. "You did," said Mrs. Grimshaw. "I heard the click." "I never trust clicks," said Mr. Lugg. "They sound like agreement." Inside the cupboard the tin remained, a squat, honest little box, painted a hopeful blue. It still contained something, but not enough to satisfy its own weight. "How much was there?" Bimble asked. "Enough," said Mrs. Grimshaw. "There is always enough for biscuits." A constable was briefly considered, but dismissed with the politeness usually reserved for doctors during minor ailments. "No need to upset anyone," Councillor Bimble said. "Peebles will turn up." Captain Peebles did not. By late morning he was being looked for, which in a town of Flaxborough's dimensions meant that people adjusted their walking routes slightly and looked behind hedges with a seriousness that implied consent rather than urgency. At the post office, the conversation took on a sharper edge. "He owed money," whispered someone who had never lent him any. "He was proud," said another, who disliked that quality in others. "People go out in storms when they have something to hide," declared Mrs. Garth, stamping envelopes with unnecessary force. By noon, the electricity had been restored, which paradoxically increased rather than reduced suspicion. Matters that return to normal too quickly are rarely trusted. A deeper tremor touched the town when the vicar's wife mentioned lightly that she thought she had seen Captain Peebles speaking to someone near the bandstand earlier that evening. "Who?" asked three voices at once. "Oh, I couldn't say," she smiled. "I don't like to say." That noon wore on with a curious gravity. Cups were refilled more often than drunk. Newspapers were folded and unfolded. A sense of shape began to form, vague but persistent, that something small had tipped itself out of balance. The absence of Captain Peebles, formerly a personal habit of wandering, now began to feel as though it belonged to the town as a whole. At 3 o'clock, a scullery maid ran into Pomeroy's waving a damp cardigan. "They've found his hat," she said. The room inhaled. "Where?" Mrs. Alsop asked. "In Mr. Gibbons' allotment, in the cabbage patch." This, in Flaxborough, was considered seriously improper. By late afternoon, rain crept into the houses through tiny imperfections in window frames, just as unease crept into conversation through tiny imperfections in logic. At the police station, Sergeant Spivey glanced at the weather and then at the message pad, and then after a thoughtful pause reached for the telephone. In a small office miles away, a man with careful handwriting and a habit of listening longer than most lifted a receiver and heard the word Flaxborough spoken with a tone that tried very hard not to mean too much. Inspector Purbright arrived in Flaxborough at 17 minutes past 4, a time chosen not for its convenience, but for its manners. He preferred arrivals that did not disturb the air too violently. The rain, by then, had reduced itself to a thin, resentful drizzle, as if it had said all it intended to say, and was now waiting to be contradicted. Purbright stepped from the train with the careful consideration of a man who accepted weather but did not engage with it. The station smelt faintly of damp timber, coal dust, and a persistent note of boiled potatoes. Sergeant Spivey met him on the platform with a salute so awkwardly timed it might have been mistaken for a breeze. "Sir." "Sergeant," said Purbright, adjusting his gloves in a manner that suggested the gloves had feelings. "It's about a man," Spivey began, instantly regretting the lack of originality. "Yes," Purbright said gently. "I find it often is." They walked towards the town in a silence that was companionable rather than empty. The streets of Flaxborough received Purbright without fuss. A small dog barked at a puddle. A lace curtain twitched, then became very still. "I'm not officially here, Sergeant," Purbright said. "No, sir." "I'm visiting a cousin who doesn't exist." "Yes, sir." "And I'm thinking about a band." Spivey considered this carefully. "I've heard about the band," he said. "The cupboard, sir." "Yes," said Purbright. "The cupboard." They did not go directly to the bandstand. That would have seemed eager. Instead, Purbright allowed himself to be guided past the cooperative, the post office, and the butcher's shop, where a woman dropped a sausage with a look of such significance that it almost attained legal standing. "People talk freely," Purbright observed. "Not to us, sir," said Spivey. "Not freely," Purbright agreed, "but constantly." At Pomeroy's tea rooms they paused for a cup of tea that had been brewed with the sort of patience that implied moral judgment. "You don't mind if we shouldn't be here?" Spivey whispered. "I'd mind more if we were somewhere sensible," Purbright said. From the neighbouring table, Mrs. Alsop's voice drifted towards them with a controlled carelessness. "Always said he was restless," she murmured. "That sort of restlessness comes from secrets." "And the money," came another voice. "And the cupboard," said a third. Purbright stirred his tea without looking at it. "There's a cupboard theme," Spivey said later, outside. "Yes," Purbright replied. "People like objects when they distrust people." They reached the bandstand just as evening began to make its hesitant arrangements. The woods still smelt faintly of last night's storm, like a coat worn by a nervous man. Councillor Bimble was there, holding his ladle as though it gave him legal authority. "Routine visit," Purbright said pleasantly, though no one had asked. "Of course," said Bimble. "Entirely routine." The cupboard door was closed now, with a neatness that suggested shame. Purbright knelt, though he did so in a way that implied he was considering it, not submitting to it. He touched the hinge lightly, like a man greeting an acquaintance rather than questioning evidence. He said. Spivey saw nothing. Bimble saw nothing. Purbright saw several things and promised none of them anything. "And the man?"
Purbright asked. Captain Peebles, Bimble said, harmless. Harmless men, Purbright said mildly, are very often at the centre of things. They walked slowly around the inside of the bandstand. Purbright's eyes rested on the music stand, on a damp cushion, on a smear of mud that had been wiped once and had refused to be wiped again. Which way did he go? Purbright asked, though the question was addressed to the air. Towards the back, said Mrs. Grimshaw, who had appeared without announcement. And the hat? Purbright asked. Allotment, said Spivey. Yes, said Purbright, I heard. They tracked nothing. They measured nothing. They took notes that contained very little. Flaxborough watched. In parlours and back rooms, cups were lifted and replaced without being drunk. In doorways, faces appeared, vanished, and reappeared with different expressions. He's not like the others, whispered someone. No, said someone else. He's quiet.
Purbright paused beside a low hedge. On one of its twigs was a scrap of dark cloth, snagged, waiting to be either noticed or forgiven. He did not touch it. He merely nodded, as if it had made a polite remark. As the light faded, Spivey glanced at him. What now, sir? Now, said Purbright, we let people make themselves more comfortable with their own stories. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, Purbright said, we see which ones change. Flaxborough had long maintained a quiet understanding that if anything went wrong, it would almost certainly be someone's fault, and that someone would probably be Mr. Lionel Crabbe. Mr. Crabbe lived in a narrow house behind the High Street, a residence that seemed to have been squeezed into existence between two more reputable buildings and had never quite forgiven the town for it. He dealt in agency, a word that covered a gratifying variety of activities ranging from minor property arrangements to the discreet movement of objects that no one, officially, wished to have moved at all. It was therefore considered a relief of a modest kind when his name began to circulate alongside Captain Peebles. Purbright did not go to see him at once. He preferred the way suspicions settled before they were disturbed. By mid-morning, the butcher had decided that Crabbe had been seen lurking near the bandstand. The word lurking in this context meant walking slowly and looking at the ground, which was, regrettably, something Mr. Crabbe did rather often. At the post office it was announced that Crabbe had once tried to sell Captain Peebles a second-hand barometer with a crack in the glass and the truth in the middle. Sergeant Spivey repeated this to Purbright with a seriousness that suggested the barometer itself ought to be questioned. "He has a way about him, sir," Spivey said. "People notice it." "Yes," Purbright replied. "Noticing is a popular activity." They found Crabbe at his shop, which smelt strongly of furniture polish, damp paper, and the faint, lingering panic of past transactions. The front window displayed 3 clocks, none of which agreed with one another, and a walking stick that appeared to have been through some sort of moral dilemma. Crabbe looked up as they entered. His face had the exhausted alertness of a man who had spent a lifetime being ready to explain himself. "Inspector," he said, though no introductions had been made. "That's very kind of you," Purbright said. Crabbe smiled thinly. "I hear you've lost a sailor," he said. "We've misplaced a gentleman," Purbright corrected. Crabbe's fingers worried at the edge of the counter. "People do that from time to time." "They do," Purbright said, "sometimes alone." "And sometimes," Crabbe went on, "because they owe money to the wrong sort." Spivey straightened slightly at this, as if a string had been tugged. "I didn't lend him any," Crabbe added quickly, "just so we're clear." "Perfect clarity can be unsettling," Purbright said. The conversation drifted with an odd civility. Crabbe admitted to having seen Captain Peebles 2 evenings before the disappearance. "He was asking about a clock," Crabbe said. "A clock?" Spivey echoed, as though the concept were foreign. "Yes," said Crab. "Something that ticks. He said he needed to hear something regular." "Did you sell him one?" Purbright asked. "I showed him one," Crab said. "A small one, travel-sized. He didn't buy it. He said he didn't like the sound of it." "Did you follow him?" Spivey asked, with more eagerness than grace. Crab raised an eyebrow. "I follow things," he said. "Only when they owe me money." Outside, the town had arranged itself into watching positions. Curtains became less decorative and more purposeful. A woman watering her front step managed to do so with no detectable liquid. By noon, the council had unofficially decided that Crab was the likely cause. This required no evidence beyond the fact that it felt comfortable. Councillor Bimble was relieved. "There's a look about him," he said at lunch. "A look suggests habits." Mrs. Grimshaw, who disliked Crab on aesthetic grounds, agreed. Purbright walked the high street slowly. He listened to two men by the ironmonger's window lower their voices only after they had already been heard. He allowed a woman to tell him, in confidence, what she had told 5 people before breakfast. "And the cupboard?" he asked, mildly, of anyone who would answer. "That was him," someone said. "He'd know how," said someone else. "He'd need the money," came a third voice. At the bandstand he examined the hedge again. The scrap of cloth remained where it was, obedient to its own small part in the world. Spivey grew restless. "It looks simple, sir," he said. "Yes," Purbright answered. "That makes me uncomfortable." That afternoon, Crab was brought in for a polite conversation that had none of the vulgarity of accusation. He sat with a hat on his knees, turning it slowly. "I never touched that cupboard," he said. "You haven't been asked," Purbright replied. "I never went near it," Crab said. "I didn't suggest you had." "I never see Peebles after the shop," Crab insisted. Purbright watched the movement of his hands, the way his voice softened slightly around the word "after," as if it was something with edges. By evening, Flaxborough felt soothed. It had a figure to mistrust and a shape to its unease. The rain fell less heavily. A butcher's dog slept. In the bandstand, the lantern had been extinguished and forgotten. In the locked cupboard, the blue tin sat quietly, lighter by just enough to matter. And in a narrow street behind the high street, Lionel Crab closed his shop with great care, as though he were not entirely sure whether he was the hunter or the hunted. The ditch lay where ditches were always likely to lie in Flaxborough, obediently beside a footpath, slightly overgrown, and carrying a thin, respectable trickle of water that had no ambition beyond moving slowly toward a darker part of the landscape. It was there that Purbright found the button. He found it in the way he found most things, without haste, without announcement, and without appearing to search for it at all. He had been looking, to any external observer, at the way the rain had flattened the grass along the path. To Sergeant Spivey, who hovered 2 steps behind with the strained patience of a man waiting for something mechanical to occur, this seemed unnecessarily poetic. "That grass," Spivey said, "took a fine beating, sir." "Yes," said Purbright. He bent, and the button appeared between 2 blades of sodden green, brown with mud, but still unmistakably a button. Dark horn, 4 neat holes, slightly chipped at the edge, as though time itself had once caught it carelessly. He did not pick it up. He merely looked. It was the sort of object no one remembers losing and no one notices until they have done so. It was also, by some quiet miracle, still attached to a fragment of black thread. "That's nothing," Spivey said. "Indeed," Purbright replied. "That's what makes it attractive." They walked
on a little. The wind had calmed to the sulkiness of a reprimanded child. The clouds arranged themselves in flatter shapes above the town, as if trying to look less involved. The allotments lay ahead, each one divided with the fierce domesticity of old men who had survived wars, committees, and the restructuring of postal deliveries. Cabbages leaned towards one another as if exchanging small, leafy confidences. Mr. Gibbons, whose patch had received Captain Peebles's hat like an insult from the sky, was there with a fork. "Morning," he said, though it was afternoon. "You don't mind if we look?" Spivey asked. "I mind," said Gibbons, "but I don't mind enough." Purbright noted the damp furrows, the neat lines, the decorative explicitness of a runner bean frame. He also noticed that the soil near the cabbages was disturbed in a way that did not belong to cabbages. "Where exactly?" he asked. Gibbons pointed with the fork. "There, amongst the respectable ones." Spivey prodded the ground unnecessarily. The earth gave slightly, and with it came the faint, reluctant smell of something that had been under pressure and had not enjoyed it. "It's been trod?" Spivey said, triumphantly. "Yes," said Purbright, "by someone who didn't care about cabbages." They walked back by the ditch without speaking. In Flaxborough, silence was not an absence, but a kind of storage. The button stayed where it was. That afternoon, Purbright allowed himself to be led into the realm of trousers. It was not, in his experience, a realm much discussed by criminals, but it was an honest one. At Pomeroy's again, Mrs. Alsop was holding court not over tea, but over stitching. "That's a good horn one," she said, when he described it, without being asked. "They were common," said Miss Vale. "Before the war." "After the war," Mrs. Alsop corrected. "During the war, people wore whatever stayed on." "You can tell a lot about a man from his buttons," she went on, "whether he lets things go, whether he's careful." At the bandstand, Councillor Bimble permitted himself to be asked. "Captain Peebles?" Purbright said conversationally. "What coat did he wear?" Bimble frowned, the way men do when encountering thoughts they have long avoided. "Dark one," he said, "with brass ones." "Brass?" said Purbright. "Yes, he polished them sometimes. Used to bring a cloth." "Did any of them ever fall off?" Purbright asked. "Oh," Bimble said, "I shouldn't think so. He was very attached to them." "And Mr. Crabbe?" Purbright asked another time, elsewhere. "He wears cheap buttons," said a small man outside the ironmonger's. "Plastic, bright. You'd notice if one went missing." The idea did not settle loudly. It merely hovered. That evening, back near the ditch, the light took on that peculiar thinness that makes everything appear slightly guilty. Purbright's eyes returned to the
button. He took it up at last between thumb and forefinger. It was heavier with water, darker with truth. "From a heavier coat," he murmured. "You think it's his?" Spivey asked. "I think," said Purbright, "that someone went through something and left something behind, as people always do when they are more occupied with themselves than with their cuffs." They walked on. Near the hedge, the scrap of cloth had loosened, just slightly, as if tired of waiting. Purbright did not touch it. He did not need to. In the evening, Lionel Crabbe sat in his narrow rooms with the 3 clocks telling him different versions of the same thing. He touched his own sleeve, unconsciously, and found all his buttons still obedient. In a smaller, quieter house nearer the market, a respectable figure sat by a small fire, running a thumb absently over a brass disc sewn firmly to a dark woolen sleeve, and thought not for the first time that storms were very untidy things. The ditch went on being a ditch, the button dried, and in the middle of Flaxborough's neatly arranged unease, something shifted just enough to be felt, and not yet enough to be named. Flaxborough wore respectability in the way it wore its front gardens, with care, with fuss, and with the unspoken understanding that weeds were a private matter best handled without witnesses. By the 3rd day, lying had not become more common. It had simply become more polished. People lied to one another in small, courteous ways, smoothing their untruths with sugar and teaspoons and the careful folding of hands. They lied with their voices steady and their eyes slightly brighter than nature had intended. It was not considered dishonest. It was considered kind. Purbright noticed. He noticed the way Mrs. Alsop now remembered Captain Peebles as quieter than she had once claimed, and the way Miss Vale developed a sudden uncertainty about times, convincing herself that clocks were unreliable when they failed to support her latest version. At the butcher's, a statement made with blunt certainty in the morning acquired shade and nuance by the afternoon. People were adjusting themselves gently to the idea that they might one day be asked something. At the vicarage, tea was offered with the faint tremor of a moral occasion. "I hope you take sugar," said Mrs. Varnum. "Only when it's freely given," said Purbright. The vicar's wife smiled and thought, not for the first time, how unsettling it was to be met by a courtesy that did not bend. "I did see Captain Peebles that evening," she said, rearranging a small stack of biscuits into more pleasing alignment. "But I couldn't say where he was going." "You could say," Purbright said gently. "Yes," she admitted. "I could, but I wouldn't care to be wrong." Her eyes flickered, not to his, but to the door. In another parlour, Councillor Bimble sat very straight and held his ladle as if it were a moral compass. "I have always encouraged Captain Peebles," he said. "A man of loyalty." "You trusted him?" Purbright asked. "I trusted the position he held," Bimble said, which was a different thing. Across the town, small rivalries emerged from their cupboards like well-aired linens. Mrs. Grimshaw had never forgiven Mrs. Denton for a misunderstanding over a raffle prize in 1958. Mr. Gibbons considered the allotment committee a nest of soft thinking. Even the barber, Mr. Gibbs, maintained a calm, silvery dislike of the chemist based on a disagreement over the correct price of hair tonic. These grievances had done no harm. Until now. Purbright walked from house to house, never announcing himself, never pushing, never taking anything more than what was offered. People felt themselves to be safe with him. That is why they slipped. They slipped into false modesty, false generosity, and false forgetfulness. They slipped into long explanations and sudden silences. And in those silences, small truths accumulated. Someone mentioned that Captain Peebles had recently taken to walking later than usual. Someone else mentioned that he had looked preoccupied, a word which in Flaxborough covered everything from mild constipation to profound disgrace. Another remembered a minor disagreement about money for the band's refreshments, a disagreement which had been treated as trivial, which had been resolved in public, and which had in no way been resolved at all. At the police station, Sergeant Spivey attempted to put order into gossip and found that it resisted not with force, but with politeness. "They all seem honest, sir," he said. "Yes," said Purbright, "and that's the difficulty." That afternoon Purbright sat quietly in a corner of Pomeroy's and listened to a conversation that had no reason to include him. "I told him," said a woman whose name he did not need, "that people were beginning to notice." "Who?" asked another. "Peebles. He was getting ideas." "What sort of ideas?" "That he mattered." The word settled with a slight, dangerous weight. Later still, Lionel Crabbe was visited again, unofficially. "They're saying it's you," Purbright said. Crabbe laughed, though it wasn't successful. "They always say it's me." "You look thinner," Purbright observed. "I've been sleeping badly," Crabbe said. "Because of the town?" "Because of myself," said Crabbe. He hesitated only slightly. "I saw him that night," he added. "You've said that," Purbright replied. "He looked frightened," Crabbe said. "Not of me, of being laughed at." That evening, the wind returned briefly, as if to check whether it was still required. In the narrow house near the market, the respectable figure with the brass-buttoned coat sat with a small tin of polish and worked at a button that did not need it. The movement was slow, careful, almost loving. A wife in the next room thought of something she could not quite shape and dismissed it as indigestion. A neighbour passing the window slowed his step for reasons he would later deny. Purbright walked once more by the ditch. The button rested in his pocket now, wrapped in paper, kept neither as evidence nor as keepsake but as a reminder. The scrap of cloth on the hedge had loosened further, clinging only by a defeated corner. He thought about the way people lied to protect their standing, and the way they lied to protect their shame, and the way these two things were often confused. Beside him, Spivey shifted. "They're all lying a bit," the sergeant said. "Yes," said Purbright, "but one of them is lying very carefully." He looked at the neat houses, the drawn curtains, the adjusted smiles, and the cups that were lifted and not drunk. Respectability in Flaxborough tightened its grip. And somewhere in that tightening, the truth stretched just slightly, as if preparing itself for a movement it could no longer avoid. The discovery began, as many discoveries in Flaxborough did, with a statement that was more confident than it was correct. "There's a body." The words travelled from the allotments to the high street with unnatural speed, propelled by bicycles, gossip, and a general human fondness for the word itself. By the time it reached Pomeroy's, it had acquired a location, a posture, and a small but tasteful amount of blood. By the time it reached the butcher, it had gained a second body and a foreign accent. Sergeant Spivey heard it in the doorway of the station, sealed the last word into a look of professional gravity, and went at once. Purbright walked. They found the shape lying not far from the ditch, in a shallow, unremarkable depression of ground that had once been pretentious enough to be called a hollow. The sky had turned the colour of diluted pewter. The hedges looked faintly offended. "It's him," said someone who should not have been there. It was not him. The shape was draped in a dark cloth of decent quality, fold upon fold, giving it the unmistakable outline of something which, to the excited imagination, could easily approximate a human form. Spivey crouched and immediately felt as though he were intruding upon something important. Purbright waited. "Shall I?" Spivey began. "If you must," Purbright said. The cloth lifted with a damp, soft sound. There was no body. What there was instead was a carefully arranged collection of band equipment, the bass drum, spare trumpet cases, a length of cable, and the large varnished triangle of Mrs. Grimshaw, looking profoundly insulted. Silence arrived abruptly, the way it does after a misunderstanding that has embarrassed everyone. "It looked," Spivey began. "Yes," Purbright said. "It was meant to." Behind them, a small crowd achieved the collective feat of looking both disappointed and relieved. "He's not in there," whispered Mrs. Alsop. "No," Spivey said. "Oh," she said, "well, the cloth arrangement had not been careless. That much was clear. It had been constructed to be seen. The folds had been placed not randomly, but with intention, as though someone had thought carefully about what a frightened mind would assume at a glance. "This was done," Spivey said, "to frighten us." "Or to encourage us," Purbright replied. "To encourage what?" "To look in the wrong direction." They stood in the muddy grass. Wind moved the hedges with the tiredness of a story too long told. A dog barked somewhere at something that did not matter. At the edge of the hollow, Purbright noticed a footprint that had no interest in being artistic, and therefore was more honest than most. It was not large, it was not small, it was careful, and beside it a scuff mark. Someone had dragged the cloth carefully. Back at the station, the news collapsed into itself. No body. It wasn't him. It was band instruments. They put the triangle on top. Flaxborough, deprived of its tragedy, did not immediately recover its balance. It hovered between shame and excitement. "That's worse," said someone. "Why?" asked another. "It means they meant it." By afternoon, explanation bloomed like damp. It was crab, some said. Others insisted Captain Peebles himself had staged it as part of a breakdown. One particularly inventive mind suggested foreign agents. Purbright listened. He listened as Councillor Bimble explained that the cloth resembled a table covering once used at a temperance function. He listened as Mrs. Grimshaw insisted that the triangle had been placed too carefully to be an accident. He listened as Lionel Crabbe, brought in again for the sake of tradition, stared quite genuinely at the description. "I don't stage things," Crabbe said. "I can hardly manage my own life." Back at the hollow, Purbright walked the edge, slowly placing his feet between the impressions left by others. Spivey watched him, waiting for instruction like a man expecting thunder. "You don't think it's a body?" Spivey said. "I think," Purbright said, "that it's a message." "To us?" "No, to the town." He paused. "And possibly to himself." "But why instruments?" "Because," Purbright said, "that is where his name was remembered without laughter." The wind shifted. A cloud that had been loitering moved on. A bird attempted a small, misplaced song. They found, not far from where the cloth had been dragged, a small indentation in the mud, shaped by something hard and round. Not a boot, not a heel, a tin. "Someone stood here?" Spivey said. "Yes." "And watched?" "Yes." "And wanted to be seen doing it?" "No," Purbright said. "Wanted to imagine being seen." That evening, the town digested the failure of its excitement with mixed emotions. Some felt cheated, some felt relieved, some felt that things had become more dangerous precisely because nothing dreadful had actually happened. In the narrow house near the market, the respectable figure sat with the weather creeping faintly through the walls. The brass buttons caught the light as the fire shifted. A thought, uninvited and unwelcome, passed through his mind. Perhaps they would think it was real. Perhaps they would stop looking at the cupboard. Perhaps they would remember other causes. He rose, paced once, then sat again. Elsewhere, in a smaller room smelling faintly of clock oil and resignation, Lionel Crabbe stared at nothing in particular and thought, with a slight and unfamiliar chill, that someone had begun to play a game in which he had not been invited to participate. Purbright walked alone for a time as the evening thickened. Lights came on behind curtains. Doors were closed gently. Voices fell just slightly. The hollow lay empty now, unconvincing and faintly ridiculous, like a stage after an over-ambitious performance. But in the grass beside it the footprint remained, and in the town itself a new and awkward understanding began to take shape, that someone was neither running nor hiding, but arranging, and that arrangements in Flaxborough were far more dangerous than ordinary crimes. Night in Flaxborough came gently, as if it were apologizing for the disturbance of daylight. Windows softened into squares of yellow. Curtains were drawn with the careful economy of people who preferred their private lives to remain theatrical only in memory, and the town settled into the small, creaking comfort of itself. The earlier excitement of the false body faded into something more awkward, like laughter remembered too late. Purbright walked without Sergeant Spivey. He preferred, at times like these, the company of his own thoughts, which were quieter and required less practical encouragement. The bandstand stood in its darkness with a dignity that had not been earned but had been maintained through habit. Rain had left faint silver marks on the railings. The roof whispered slightly as the breeze pushed beneath its tired edges. He stepped inside, alone, and listened. Wood creaked. Somewhere a rat improved its moral independence. He thought about Captain Peebles, not heroic, not special, not large. A man built of small preferences and larger silences, not unhappy in the way tragedy required, but dissatisfied in the way towns disliked, invisible for so long that the mere wish to be seen could begin to feel like a kind of indecency. Purbright imagined him polishing his brass buttons, not for shine, but for proof that something on him could be made deliberate. He walked to the cupboard and rested his hand lightly on the wood. He did not open it. He thought about Lionel Crabbe. Crabbe, who understood how objects moved between hands, but not how pride moved through a man. Crabbe, whose reputation was used by the town the way a rug is used to hide inconvenient bulges. He thought about the button, not the object itself, small and damp and now waiting, quietly in paper, but what it represented, a hurried movement, a moment where thought had been replaced by need, a man tugged by something stronger than caution. He felt beneath his glove the slight roughness of the hinge. The town had become very tidy in its untruths. They had arranged themselves as people always did when reality began to look directly at them. They had turned objects into suspects, shadows into motives, odd men into answers. No one, so far, had allowed in the possibility of embarrassment. Purbright walked to the edge of the bandstand and looked out into the gardens. The paths lay like thin, wet ribbons. A bench shone faintly. A tree tapped one branch against another, as if struggling with a thought. He considered the nature of small-town fear. It was not fear of death generally. They read about that, they discussed it, they allowed it to be spoken by strangers. Their real fear was of ridicule, of pity, of being gently laughed at by people who had known them since before they had grown into their proper mistakes. He imagined the making of the false body, not in panic, not in rage, but in a slow, deliberate arrangement, folding, adjusting, stepping back to look. Moving a trumpet an inch to improve the effect, a man trying to make something large enough to be believed, a man trying to become dangerous enough to be remembered. He thought of the tin, small, blue, good-natured, honest. It had not been emptied, only lightened, not stolen as much as borrowed by a hand that felt it deserved a little weight of its own. He turned away from the bandstand and walked back through the gardens. Behind a hedge, the scrap of dark cloth lifted lazily in the evening breeze, moved by nothing more sinister than air. It had once been caught by violence or by urgency, and now it simply waited, a quiet witness, no one invited to speak. Funny things, Purbright murmured to himself. Pride and fear, hard to tell which is worse. In a house near the market, the respectable figure sat stiffly in a chair that knew his shape too well. He stared into a fire that was behaving itself. His coat hung across the back of another chair, the brass buttons catching the light. He found one with his fingers and pressed it, as though assuring it of its safety. His thoughts were careful now, calculated. They would think of Crabbe. They would think of storms. They would think of shadows and cupboards and thieves. They would not imagine the quiet, sour weight of being treated lightly for too long. He folded his hands and stared at them. In another, narrower house with clocks that disagreed because they were allowed to, Lionel Crabbe sat with his head against a wall and listened to the quietness which was louder than most sounds. He had never believed in storms changing people. He began, gradually, to believe that people changed storms. Back in the small station, Sergeant Spivey polished a button on his own tunic, failed to remember why he had started, and stopped. Purbright walked the last length of the high street alone. A cat crossed his path and paused, considered him briefly, and permitted him to exist. Behind curtains, eyes moved. Behind doors, hands tightened. Behind smiles, thoughts refined. Flaxborough was thinking. And thinking, Purbright knew, was far more dangerous than running. He stopped at the corner, looked once more towards the dim shape of the bandstand, and allowed himself the smallest of inward acknowledgments. The town would not be saved by evidence, it would be undone by manners. He turned his collar up against nothing, stepped back into the ordinary darkness, and let the quiet settle around him like a familiar and patient coat. Tea in Flaxborough was not merely a beverage, it was a ceremony, a measure of standing, and on this particular afternoon a trap with a lace-edged tablecloth. Pomeroy's tea rooms had been prepared with more care than usual. The lace had been shaken out an extra time. The spoons had been aligned with faint military pride. The cake stand had been rotated so that its most respectable side faced the door. Purbright arrived precisely when he had said he might. "Afternoon," he said, as though it were an observation and not an event. Mrs. Alsop fluttered first, recovered herself, and then fluttered in a more dignified way. "We don't often get gentlemen like you," she said. "I hope I won't become a habit," Purbright replied. Sergeant Spivey sat 2 tables away, pretending with great concentration to read a newspaper whose pages had not been turned in some time. The invitation had not been written, but it had been understood. By 10 minutes past 4, the right people had drifted in as if by accident. Councillor Bimble chose a seat near the wall. Mrs. Grimshaw installed herself with geometric certainty. The vicar's wife arrived with a smile and a hesitation. Lionel Crabbe did not arrive, which was felt to be in character. One place remained empty. Purbright had arranged that too. The door opened again, carefully, as though whoever used it were not quite certain they had the right. Mr. Harold Fenchurch entered. He was the sort of man who gave no offence by existing, which was both his talent and his problem. He wore a dark coat with brass buttons that had been polished without joy. He removed his hat and held it with the gentleness of a man holding something that might make noise if offended. Mrs. Alsop dropped half a teaspoon. "Mr. Fenchurch," she said, "how unexpected." "I was passing," he said, which was not entirely untrue. "Do sit," said Purbright, standing slightly as if this were a courtesy accomplished between equals. Fenchurch sat. Tea was poured. A plate of biscuits was set before them, arranged with the neatness of things meant to be chosen. Conversation began with the deliberate awkwardness of a clock starting again after being dropped. "The weather," said Mrs. Grimshaw. "Yes," said Councillor Bimble. "I can't say I trust it," said the vicar's wife. Purbright allowed silence to polish itself. "You must all be very tired," he said at last, "after such excitement." A small stirring. "We're a peaceful town," Bimble said. "That's what makes it interesting," Purbright replied. He lifted one biscuit, looked at it, and set it back untouched. "No one likes to think ill of their neighbours," he said conversationally. "It makes the cups feel heavier." There was a faint tightening of hands around saucers. "I've been thinking about fear," he went on, "not the kind that shouts, the sort that sits quietly and makes one tidy one's thoughts." Mrs. Alsop nodded without knowing why. "Sometimes," Purbright said, "people begin to feel that they've been looked through for too long." Mr. Fenchurch's eyes shifted briefly to the plate of biscuits. "Not ignored," Purbright added. "That sounds too dramatic. Simply faded." Spivey turned a page of the newspaper without reading it. "I've met men," Purbright said weak, "who have never done anything wicked in their lives and yet have wanted, very badly, to be taken seriously by those who smile at them." He let that rest gently on the table. The brass buttons on Fenchurch's coat caught the light. "It's very hard," Purbright said softly, "to ask for money from a tin that everyone thinks is for biscuits." The room cooled by a degree. Mrs. Grimshaw's lips parted. "Especially," he continued, "if one means to borrow rather than steal." Councillor Bimble's ladle, absent from his hand for the first time in public memory, lay useless in his pocket. "They might tell themselves," Purbright said, "that they'll put it back." A silence settled that was not shared. They might tell themselves they deserve it, not because they are poor, but because they have been polite for too long. Fenchurch's fingers tightened around his teacup. "And when they are afraid of being found out," Purbright went on, still conversational, still kind, "they may attempt to make the town look the other way." Spivey lowered the paper slightly. "A scene, for instance," said Purbright. "Something theatrical, something shaped like danger." Mrs. Alsop did not reach for her biscuit. "And if such a man were to hurry," Purbright added gently, "and brush against a hedge and lose a button." No one looked at Mr. Fenchurch, which somehow was worse. "I've found," Purbright said with a faint, apologetic smile, "that when one speaks of such things aloud, the guilty man often reveals himself by what he refuses to touch." He looked at the plate between them. "All of you," he said, "please help me." Hands moved. Biscuits were lifted. Crumbs fell. Politeness was maintained. Mr. Fenchurch did not move. The biscuit nearest him remained untouched, as though it were a small white island. For a long moment, no one breathed loudly enough to be heard. Then he reached up, slowly, undid the top button of his coat, and set the loose brass disc quietly on the saucer beside him. "I didn't think," he said, "anyone would miss it." Purbright inclined his head. "They always miss it," he said. "That's why it hurts." The truth, when it finally began to move in Flaxborough, did so with the politeness of a guest who knows he has stayed too long. No one at the table spoke immediately after Mr. Fenchurch placed the loose brass button upon the saucer. The small click it made against the china travelled through the room more efficiently than any raised voice could have done. It was a sound that had edges to it. Mrs. Alsop stared at the button as though it might multiply. Councillor Bimble leaned back with the slow, careful dignity of a man avoiding a draught. The vicar's wife folded her hands and unfolded them again, unsure now which version of herself to use. Spivey did not move at all. Purbright, who had watched far louder confessions pass with much less order, waited. "Would you like more tea?" Mrs. Alsop asked, instinctively. "No, thank you," said Mr. Fenchurch. His voice was very calm. "I suppose," he went on, "there's no point in pretending otherwise." "No," Purbright said gently, "it wouldn't be kind." Outside, a tram rattled faintly in a part of the world Flaxborough did not much care for. Inside, the air remained perfectly measured. There was no hand on Fenchurch's shoulder, no demand, no sudden interest in handcuffs, only the faint, collective embarrassment of a community noticing itself too clearly. "You see," Fenchurch said, staring not at anyone but at the worn edge of the tablecloth, "I never meant to keep it." No one contradicted him. "They never let me feel important," he continued. Not cruelly, just gently. Purbright nodded very slightly. "I told myself it was only a little," Fenchurch said, "for a day or two, to feel what it was like to decide something." The town, represented by its most ordinary parts, breathed very carefully. "And when I thought they might find out," he added, "I panicked." "You're not a panicking man," Purbright said. "No," Fenchurch agreed. "That's what frightened me." He explained the cloth without speaking of it as a crime. He spoke of folding, of moving, of the strange relief of arranging things so they pointed somewhere else. He spoke of standing back and thinking how clever, for once, it looked. No one interrupted, This, in Flaxborough, was considered good manners. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "You didn't," Purbright said, "but you made them afraid. That's sometimes worse." Mrs. Grimshaw pressed her lips together as though she had tasted something unpleasant. "And poor Crab," Fenchurch murmured. "I thought they'd go to him. They always do." Purbright allowed the thought to hang, examined and accepted. There was no drama, no justice delivered by volume, no satisfaction beyond the careful realignment of truth into its proper lines. "I'll come with you," Fenchurch said at last, looking to Spivey. Spivey, who had expected everything except this, stood and nodded. "I'll fetch my hat," Fenchurch added. "You're wearing it," said Mrs. Alsop. He removed it and smiled, for the first time less carefully. Outside, a small knot of townspeople waited in the manner of people who hoped something would happen without believing it decent for it to do so too loudly. They watched him walk between the two men. Some were surprised, some were relieved, some were dissatisfied. At the bandstand, the wind moved through the rails in a way that sounded faintly like applause, but meant nothing of the kind. The blue tin returned now to its cupboard, felt heavier. That evening, the town took on the careful exhaustion of people who have watched something end without having to run. Curtains were drawn, not hastily, but thoughtfully. Doors were closed with slightly different expressions. Mr. Crab, hearing the news, sat in his narrow shop and felt, for the first time in several days, that the air inside him was possible. Purbright, returning slowly along the high street, did not look back once. He had no interest in victory, only in balance. In a small, careful room of the station, Mr. Fenchurch removed his coat. The buttonholes seemed larger somehow. He sat, folded his hands upon his knees, and waited. And over the roofs of Flaxborough, the sky settled into its usual unremarkable shade, having finished with its last and quiet disturbance. Rain returned to Flaxborough without drama, which was how it preferred to behave. It fell straight down, without argument or display, and lay upon the roofs and pavements like a thought that had no wish to be discussed. The town resumed. It did so with the quiet efficiency of people who were used to continuing, no matter what had briefly disturbed them. Pomeroy's opened at the usual time. The lace tablecloth was shaken, folded, and shaken again. Cups were placed in their accustomed positions, though a few were turned a fraction inward, as if listening to themselves. The plate of biscuits appeared, full and slightly more carefully spaced than before. Mrs. Alsop spoke less loudly. This was not noticed. Miss Vale read twice as much. This was. At the bandstand, Councillor Bimble returned to the ladle. The civic band met again, and though the notes had not improved, the confidence with which they failed was once more properly civic. The cupboard remained locked. The blue tin felt, for all practical purposes, the same weight. Captain Peebles did not return, though it was understood now that he had never truly left, having slipped quietly into the category of those who would be discussed with softened voices and improved recollection. His name, once uncertain, began to carry a delicate respect, as most names do when the person can no longer object. Mr. Fenchurch sat in a room that was no longer full of furniture. The walls were plain. The chair was plain. The hours passed with a clarity he had never previously enjoyed. He felt neither hunted nor relieved. He felt, in an unfamiliar way, known. He thought often of the biscuit. In a smaller, narrower shop behind the high street, Lionel Crab polished a clock that did not work and found that, for the first time in days, he did not mind. The 3 clocks in the window argued as usual. This gave him comfort. "It weren't me," he said to no one in particular. No one contradicted him. At the police station, Sergeant Spivey wrote longer reports. He used fewer exclamation marks. On one afternoon, he noticed that he was polishing the same button for no good reason and stopped. Rain moved on. Purbright remained for one night longer than required, which was how he did most things. He did not like to go while the air was still arranging itself. He walked the town without being looked at too directly. Curtains did not twitch. Doors did not breathe. Cats crossed his path with no special messages to deliver. At the bandstand he rested a hand on the rail and felt the small, ordinary tiredness of old wood. "This sort of thing," he said very softly, "never looks like much from the outside." The hedge still held the last scrap of dark cloth, now quite loose, as if it had decided it belonged there after all. He did not remove it. The ditch carried on being a ditch. The grass grew back in the places where it had been pressed. The shallow hollow near the path lost its shape and its intention. By Sunday, Flaxborough had adjusted itself to the story. It had found the version that sat most comfortably, and that version began to replace the real one with quiet competence. People said that Mr. Fenchurch had always been a strange one. They said that Captain Peebles had looked troubled. They said that Lionel Crabbe had been a dangerous influence, and then forgot why. On Monday, rain stopped entirely. The sky became pale and uncommitted. Windows were opened an inch wider. Birds attempted conversations they could not finish. Purbright packed his bag in a room that smelt faintly of soap and old decisions. His notes were neat. They would remain private. He did not believe in dragging the quiet into public view once it had found its place. Sergeant Spivey walked him to the station. "All done, sir?" Spivey asked. "Yes," Purbright said. "Town will forget," Spivey said. "No," said Purbright. "It will remember a better version." The train arrived with the tired patience of something used to carrying away men who did not announce themselves when they arrived. Purbright stepped aboard. He did not look back. Flaxborough watched the train leave with the mild interest it reserved for passing weather. The rails sang their small, metallic song, then fell silent. That evening, Mrs. Alsop washed her cups more carefully than necessary. Councillor Bimble counted the chairs in the bandstand and found them all present. Mrs. Grimshaw adjusted her triangle and didn't know why. The respectable houses shut their doors, the respectable curtains settled, the respectable secrets remained. Rain, when it returned much later that week, moved harmlessly across the roofs and disappeared into the gutters without altering a single thought. Purbright, already in another town, thought once of Flaxborough, and then folded the thought neatly away. Nothing looked changed, nothing was forgiven, nothing was washed clean, and Flaxborough, as ever, went on quietly minding what could be seen and very carefully keeping what could not.